Good evening and welcome to the RAF Museum. We are live here in London and I'm delighted this evening to be joined by Jim Nicolson, who's going to be talking about his uncle, Wing Commander James Brindley Nicolson, DFC and BC. So Jim, I'll hand over to you and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, and good evening everybody, both the people in the museum and at home, and thank you very much for tuning in, as they say. I'm very grateful to the RAF Museum for inviting me to give this talk about my uncle, who, as many of you will know, was the only Fighter Command pilot to be awarded the Victoria Cross for the whole of the Second World War. This is an event part of the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, when, as Churchill said, not just this country, but the whole of the civilized world stood on the brink. And I have to say at the beginning, I have given this talk a number of times now, and the shortest time I've ever done it in is 20 minutes, and the longest is 1 3/4 hours. So the plan tonight is I will talk for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for some questions, and hopefully that will then complete the evening successfully. Now, if you remember nothing else from this talk, I'd like you to remember these two facts. The first is that we spell our surname Nicolson without an H. It causes great consternation, and this chap was particularly sensitive about that. And the second is that the firstborn son in our family is always called James. So my grandfather is James, this guy's James. I'm my dad's only son, I'm James, and I have two sons. The oldest one is called James. I normally invite audience participation on that point, but I'll let you off this evening. And it's to my great pride, I can tell you tonight that earlier this year, James and his beautiful wife, Emma, had a little baby born to them, a little baby boy, who's a brother to their 4-year-old sister. And again, I won't invite the answer, but I hope you'll recognize that it's a surprise to nobody that he's called James as well. So we've got loads of James Nicholsons. So that's right. So there's no H in Nicholson, and the firstborn son is called James. Except this guy wasn't. He was christened Eric after a relative who was killed in the Great War. Everybody in the Royal Air Force referred to him as Nick. All the records, including here, refer to him as James, and his wife and family only ever called him Bill. It was that which took the first hour of that long talk. So if we can just go with his Nick or James or Nicholson, that's great. So he's born in 1917 up in Hampstead. The family moved down to the south coast to Shoreham, and he's desperately keen to join the Royal Air Force. He's been fascinated with the Royal Air Force all his life, like many of us, and wanted to get in. But before he was old enough to get in, he joined a local engineering firm, the Ricardo Engineers. And this photograph is of him in their cricket team. This is the guy we're talking about. This is my uncle, James Nicolson. As you can see, he's quite tall. He's 6'3", which is brilliant if you're a fast bowler, and he was a bit of a demon fast bowler. Less good if you're trying to get into the cockpit of one of the interwar planes. However, he does indeed get into the Royal Air Force on a short service commission in 1936, and after training, when he's classified as being average, no special faults, they hadn't quite developed motivational training, I think, in those days. He's posted to number 72 Squadron up at Church Fenton. And they are flying these aircraft here. And many people immediately recognize this as the Gloucester Gladiator. This was the Eurofighter of the day. And this particular aircraft was his own personal mount, if you like, K6140. I should have explained earlier, actually, that ordinarily when I give these talks, there's quite a little bit of audience involvement and participation. Sadly, for the COVID restrictions, that isn't possible this evening. So to make up for that, for the people in the museum, I've devised a short test for you at the end as compensation. So I hope you'll look forward to that. So here we are, Nicholson's aircraft, K6140. Up at Duxford, there is a beautifully restored airworthy Gladiator in 72 Squadron colours. So if you ever see that flying, that's what this would have looked like. Another question I like to ask the audience at this point is, what's the obvious thing about this formation? You can see K6140, so that is my uncle flying this Gladiator. And I ask, what's the obvious point about that? And the audience always replies, they're flying very close together, which clearly they are. And this was brilliant for display flying, but this was a tactic that we took into combat in the early days of the war, in the Battle of France and the early part of the Battle of Britain. The logic for this was that because of the machine guns on these Gladiators had 4 machine guns, one under each wing and one either side of the fuselage, they'd calculated that the German bombers, when they came over, would be unescorted because the German fighters didn't have the range to get from Germany to Britain. Therefore, if you had 3 Gladiators together in tight formation, when the leader shouts fire, all 3 fire. You've tripled the destructive power. And the Germans had a quaint phrase for this. They called it the Idiotenreihen, which stands for row of idiots. Because what you can see is whilst this guy is looking around, these 2 are concentrating on not hitting him. And that's a highly significant point that comes in later in the talk. So he's on 72 Squadron. Life is great. He loves his RAF life. And here he is with some of his friends. I'll go through these in a little detail. On the immediate left is this guy called Hiram Smith, a Canadian. He comes in again later in the story. Next is my uncle. Hiram gets badly wounded during the Battle of Britain. He gets hit by cannon shells and very badly hurt. Nick will talk about. Humferson, this guy is killed in action. Sheen came from Australia. He gets wounded in later stages of the war. St. John Pig gets killed. That's this guy. Thompson came from New Zealand. And Elsenden is the guy on the right-hand side. And I believe both of these were injured too. In other words, not one of these fellows emerged unscathed from the war, if indeed they did. And when they went flying, they used to love mucking about. And one of their favorite things was a couple of them had these little MG sports cars. So they'd race them around the place as fast as they could in reverse. And when that got boring, what they would do is they'd blindfold the driver, and the guy would sit next to him and shout instructions at him. But what also they did was they went out and about and socialized, and Nick went out and at a local dance, he met and fell in love with a very pretty farmer's daughter called Muriel. And they hadn't been going out very long when he proposed marriage. She refused on the basis that Nick was still only 21 and she was 35. And even these days, that might be the source of comment. You can imagine in the late 30s, that was considered to be absolutely impossible. But being the persistent chap he was, on the 29th of July 1939, they get married. Muriel's the one on the right, in the white, by the way. I'd like to draw your attention to the Guard of Honor, because ordinarily you'd expect it to be of other officers, fellow officers, but you will see Nicholson's actually got a Guard of Honor of NCOs, and I think that's a highly significant thing about his character. He was very much one of his, like to be part of a team. And in fact, on every Friday, he would give his ground crew, the fitter and the rigger, a packet of Players' cigarettes on the basis if they kept him alive, they were going to get their cigarettes. Around this time, the squadron re-equipped with Spitfires, and Nicholson's personal mount was a particular Mark 1A Spitfire. The serial number was K9942. And they were far more complicated to fly than the Gladiator, obviously. And because of some of the problems they had operating these on the grass runway, they became a little bit of a concern. And then around this time, Nicholson was transferred from 72 Squadron to 249 Squadron, where he met up with a young pilot called Tom Neal, who many people will know about. And again, Tom comes in later on in the story. And the problems with the Spitfire and its landing became such that they re-equipped with Hurricanes. And that wasn't necessarily a popular move because obviously the Hurricane was less glamorous, and it also did have quite a serious technical fault, which is that if it was in combat and it caught fire, the pilots would be very badly burnt. And again, it's at this point I would ordinarily invite, i.e. pick on a member of the audience to come out front and be a Hurricane pilot. But tonight what I'm going to do is just show you this, which is an illustration of my uncle's Hurricane. GN is 249 Squadron. The squadron code is letter A. And the thing about the Hurricane, unlike the Spitfire, which is all metal, was that the Hurricane was fabric from the wood, from this point, the cockpit back. So at the front, you've got a Mark III Merlin engine, then a gap, instrument panel, pilot, fuselage. Except, of course, as everybody knows, there wasn't a gap there. What would be the worst thing to have there? A fuel tank. What have we got there? A 28-gallon fuel tank. Also, there's a 35-gallon fuel tank in the wing roots, right by his feet. So what? Well, the so what was that if the engine caught fire, there would be damage very likely to the fuselage, which was wood and Irish linen. And that would create a through draft that would suck the air and suck the flames through the cockpit. I would like to be able to illustrate this by reference to this beautiful Hurricane that's behind me. And from here on, this is just wood and Irish linen. So if this gets damaged, it sucks the fire through, and what it hits first is the pilot. And the pilot would suffer incredible damage, incredible injuries. Many of you will have seen those terrible photographs. So the phenomenon was called Hurricane hands, and what that meant was that the hands would be so badly damaged, they would actually physically melt into balls. There was one poor victim of this, a Jack Fleming of 605 Squadron, who had been burnt in this way. He managed to bail out. He was terribly burnt all over. But he chanced to land in a tennis club where there was a match going on between two doctors, saw what had happened to his hands, and they got a knife and split the fingers, separated them, tied them to the heads of tennis rackets, and got him off to hospital. So we're now in the middle of the Battle of Britain, and things aren't going as well. We're taking a lot of casualties, we're inflicting a lot of casualties, and I haven't got time to go through the full tactics of the Battle of Britain. Many of you will be very, very expert on this, I know. But it must be said that morale was not quite as buoyant as some people imagine, and in many places, as people were seeing their mates getting killed, or perhaps even worse, very badly burnt, they were starting to get very thoughtful about this. And there's one particular incident I'd like to talk about. Squadron leader Terence Gregg, who's a 27-year-old New Zealander, was attached to 87 Squadron down at Biggin Hill in Hurricanes. And they were scrambled to deal with the raid. He said that he had 4 other Hurricanes with him, and the pilots had sat there all morning waiting for the call, very quiet. They weren't playing chess, they weren't playing cricket, they weren't playing football, they weren't reading the paper. They were just reflecting on whether it's their turn next. So morale was not great. They took off to deal with this German raid, and the raid was 120 aircraft, including 60 Messerschmitt 109s. So you've got 5 Hurricanes coming in, taking on this vast armada. Well, old Terry thought, he afterwards said he didn't know quite what he could do or what he could say to try and motivate his men. So he just went on the radio and said, "Okay, chaps, usual tactics, let's just surround them." And so they got stuck in. But as I say, things weren't great. And this is an iconic photograph of one of my heroes. This is Brian Lane, Sandy Lane, the senior officer of 19 Squadron up at Falmere near Duxford. He's a Spitfire pilot. He doesn't come into the story beyond, I think this gives a wonderfully graphic illustration of the pressure these guys are under. So this photograph is on the 14th of August at Church Fenton. Nicolson is just about to get into his Hurricane, fly down to Boscombe Down. He's very excited about the prospect of getting into a busy zone of which was 11 fighter group. But he was reflecting on the fact that Muriel, by now, is 6 months pregnant, and he was a bit concerned about her welfare. So they get down to Boscombe Down on the 14th, and on the 16th, this is when the big event happens. And Nicholson and the squadron get scrambled at 1:05 to deal with a raid over Southampton. He's a section leader, and he's got 2 Hurricanes with him, one being piloted by a young chap called Martin King, and the other by a chap called Wizzy King, Eric King, nicknamed Wizzy, I don't know why. And they take off, and Nicholson spots some German bombers, points that out, and gets told to go and take his 2 Hurricanes to take on these German bombers. So he peels off the formation to go and do that when some Spitfires get in front of him. So he's now having to navigate his way back to rejoin the rest of the squadron. And if you remember that photograph of the Gladiators with the Type Vic, that's the sort of formation these Hurricanes were in. So Nicholson is trying to map read, check where he is. The other 2 pilots are keeping, nobody, it seems, was keeping as much of a lookout as they needed to do. And they got bounced by some German fighters, some Messerschmitt 109s, hit all 3 planes. Martin King's plane is set alight, so he does what he's told to do, pulls back the canopy, bails out. The other guy, Wizzy King, manages to get his plane back. He's uninjured by this. Nicholson's plane is set alight, and he's in an inferno. So he pulls the cockpit back, gets ready to bail out, and as he's doing that, he sees a German fighter go past. And he was so angry at being shot down that he just sits back in this ball of flame. There is some controversy about which aircraft it was that he was going after, whether it was a Messerschmitt 109 or a Messerschmitt 110. I don't know. He's very clear it was a 110. People that know will know you can't really confuse the two. But as I say, there is some debate about that. So he's chasing this plane as hard as he can and eventually can't take the heat anymore, and he bails out. And he's coming down on his parachute. He's now had cannon shells. The Germans operated cannon shells much bigger than the machine gun bullets we were using. He's been hit in the ankle, in the eye. He's massively burnt. His hands are in terrible state. His face is too. And he's coming down on his parachute. And he gets buzzed by a German fighter, but doesn't get hit by that. But what does happen, and this didn't come out during the war, is by chance coming down on his parachute quite close to the first guy, Martin King. And for reasons that nobody has been able to establish, a detachment of the army who are nearby opened fire on them. And they peppered my uncle in the backside with gunshot lead. But more importantly, they hit Martin King, and it is said that they caused his parachute to collapse. Martin had been fine up until now. And his parachute collapses, and he falls onto the roof of this house here, number 3, Clifton Road, Shirley, Southampton. His parachute wraps itself around the chimney stack. He slides down, the straps break, he collapses into the garden where he dies in the arms of the householder. That's the guy there. He's 18. He is the youngest pilot in the RAF to die during the Battle of Britain. And he didn't fire a shot. So this is Nicholson's crash site, as you can see. It has to be said that while this was all happening, Winston Churchill was at the 11 Group Control Centre, Uxbridge, and he watched all this. He made one of his unannounced visits, and he saw all this happening, and he reported later being sick with fear when he saw the enormity of what was going on. And when he came out to go in the car to go home, somebody started talking to him. He said, "Don't speak, I've never been so moved." He scribbles down some notes because he was going to make a talk in the House of Commons shortly afterwards. And he says, "How's this sound? Never in the history of mankind has so much been owed by so many to so few." And his secretary said, "Well, what about Jesus and the disciples?" "Oh, yeah." He said, "Okay, hang on. He said, "What about never in the field of human conflict?" And of course, that speech has gone down in history. So Nicholson is now on the ground at this crash site. And it's said that there's a story that not everybody thinks is accurate, but nevertheless, I'll tell you, a local butcher's boy sees this and sees what the army had done, marches up, demands to know who's in charge. This sergeant says he is, and the butcher's boy knocks him out. So when the ambulance from Nicolson arrives, they take the sergeant instead of him. But they get him to hospital. But before they do, the local police officer is summoned, and Nick dictates a telegram to him, which says, "Shot down, darling, very slightly hurt. Particulars will follow. All my love, Nick," to tell Muriel. The police officer shows it to Nicolson, says, "Is that what you want?" And he gets quite angry. He says, "You put an H in Nicolson, do it again," which he has to do. He goes off to hospital and starts to make his recovery. It's worth seeing these. This is Muriel with his uniform, and you can see the damage that's been inflicted to him. There's his Mae West. He was put in hospital, and they operated on his hands, which were the main problem. You can see this photograph here. And off he goes down to recover down in Torquay. So he's making his recovery, and then on the 7th of November, Hiram Smith, the guy that I mentioned before, says that he was out with Nick, and they came back in, and Nick got a telegram telling him he'd been awarded the Victoria Cross. He was absolutely dumbfounded by this. So he sent another telegram to Muriel. It said, "Darling, just got VC. Don't know why. Letter follows. All my love, Nick." And I have here that very telegram. This is it. And again, I would normally pass this around, but obviously that won't be possible today. So there's a huge amount of press coverage, and he thought he was pretty good at everything, my uncle, and he thought he was a good singer, and he formed the Harmony Boys. I think the expression on the drummer suggests that maybe he wasn't quite as good as he thought himself to be. He also played this, the Swanee whistle, and again, I would invite at this point somebody from the audience to play the Swanee whistle, because this is the very instrument that he's playing there. So as I can't ask anybody else to do it, I'll have to do it myself. Do you recognize that? I love Beethoven, it's lovely. This other one is of him, and it's the expression on the other guy's faces. These two are looking horrified, and he's a bit stuck because he can't get away. And this next photo is one that I personally find rather emotional, and I don't like looking at this, but I will show it to you. It's an extremely rare event, and it's of James Nicolson buying a round of drinks in a mess. I hate that photograph. So he's now up there, and it's around now he gets a telegram from Muriel on the 16th of November, which says, "Nicolson Jr. bailed out safely at 9:15 this morning." So he's got a little baby. It's a boy, and he's christened James. So they go off to the ceremony at Buckingham Palace the following week, and Nick gets the VC. He's now extremely concerned about why he's got the VC, when so many other pilots that he knew about, and many that he didn't know, were doing heroic things day by day. And in this photograph, I think you can sense he's really concerned about that. He got told off for not putting up his VC medal ribbon. And when he eventually did, he then used to wear his raincoat over the top. He felt very awkward about that. He spent a long time getting back to operational flying because he felt very much the pressure to prove to everybody, including himself, that he did deserve it. And later on in 1943, he gets allocated as commanding officer of 27 Squadron, flying Beaufighters over in Burma. And they form a fantastic team. But after each successful sortie, they always end up in the pub, which is great. There's a story here about the pets. They all had pets, 2 Himalayan bears, Rupert and Elsie. I don't think I'm going to have time to go through that at the moment. There's another one of Elsie. The tour ends, and he gets the DFC, and there he is with his navigator, Franklin. He's only 27. Can you see how he's aged? And if you can see his hands, they're really in a bad shape. He then gets allocated to a staff officer job, which he loathed, and keeps badgering, trying to get back to aircraft. He then gets allocated to 355 Squadron as, to give them advice about how to fly in extreme weather conditions and fighter tactics. And on the 2nd of May, 1945, He gets a flight in this aircraft here, which is a consolidated Liberator. It's this very plane, Arthur Robert from 355 Squadron. This plane takes off at just after midnight on the 2nd of May on a bombing raid on Rangoon. And after a couple of hours, the starboard outer engine, that one, catches fire. They put it out, but they can't restart the engine. Shortly after that, the next one, there's 4 engines on these planes, catches fire. And they can't restart that, so they're going to be ditching. And that's what they do in the middle of the night in the Indian Ocean. 10 men on this plane, 3 get out when it crashes. Nicholson's one of them, but it takes 16 hours for the rescue teams to get to them. And by that time, sadly, Nicholson has drowned and his body is not recovered. And his wife, Muriel, gets the telegram telling her of her husband's death on the 8th of May, 1945, which, as we all know, was VE Day, when all the church bells are ringing and everyone's jumping up and down. You've seen the films. He's commemorated at the Kranji War Memorial in Singapore. He hasn't got a grave, as I mentioned, and it's now the turn for Muriel's time to go back to Buckingham Palace. This is in October to collect her husband's DFC. And there you've got young James wearing his daddy's medal. Such a sad photograph, I always say. Thousands of women in her position in this country, as there were in Canada, Australia, South Africa, America, Japan, Italy, Germany, Russia. Nick left her estate of £212, 19 shillings and 7 pence. I can explain that in the questions after. That doesn't mean very much. We now move on to, after the war, commemorations. At the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, they unveiled a plaque, and there's Muriel. This is on the crash site that you saw. This guy here is the police officer, and shortly after the ceremony, he presented Muriel with the telegram that he had, the draft that he had. And again, this is that very telegram. The RAF operate VC-10s, each one's named after a VC recipient. Again, I'd invite you to tell me what's wrong with that. I think the clue's in the name. But that was rectified, I have to say. This was a street named in Shoreham. Looks great, but for 20 years it was had an H in the name. They had to have the ceremony back again. The RAF operated the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, the fantastic Hurricane LF-363 in his colours. It hadn't been flying very long in his colours when it caught fire midair and crashed. The medals, Muriel had to sell the medals. I went along to the auction. They sold for a world record of £110,000 and were donated to the RAF Museum. Now, great, time for the test. I don't know how we're going to do this really, but if you could put your hands up, can anybody tell me the serial number of the Spitfire that my uncle flew? No, good, that makes it very simple, because it was K9942, if you remember, and this aircraft, the very plane, has survived the war. It's the oldest Spitfire in the world, bar none, and you can go and see it today up at RAF Cosford. The RAF in 2015 finished their display Eurofighter in my uncle's colours. There's me with the pilot, Ben Westerby Brooks, a charming man. And you can see that they've got the Eurofighter very faithfully representing his colours. And this is a highly significant insignia that was put on at the last minute, thanks to some global research by some very dear friends of mine who were able to prove that that was what was on Nicholson's plane. I'll show you this. I went back the following year to a dinner at the RAF Conisbee, and they made me sit in this. Bit tragic, really. Tom Neal survived the war, delightful man. I'm very proud to say I knew him. He eventually passed away at the age of 97, and I treasure the times that we had together. And a couple of years ago, the firm that owned the area where the crash site was have built a new building there. This is a firm called Leonardo's, a world-leading company in technology. And they invited me along because they were going to name this building Nicholson House. And there's me with my lovely wife, Doreen, who can't be with me tonight. So what happens next? Well, Muriel never married. She lived forever in his memory, and also for her son, James. Very sadly, when James was 44, on what would have been his father's 68th birthday, he crashes his car and is burnt to death. And that really was a problem for Muriel. We used to visit her, Dorian and I, a couple of times a year. She was such a wonderful person. And you can see there is a photograph of Nick in the background. She kept fresh flowers by his photograph as a way of keeping his memory alive. She went into a nursing home at the end and was furious when she got a telegram from the Queen when she was 100, because she kept telling the staff and everybody else there she's actually 96. But she sadly passed away when she was 102. But what she did every night was to play the BBC interview that I think I mentioned at the beginning. And what I'd like to do now is for you to hear that interview again. This is something which I mentioned before. His friends thought was hilarious, but nevertheless, I'd like you now to please listen to this and off we go. Just get the sound up. Oh, sorry.
That was a glorious day. The sun was shining from a cloudless sky, and there was hardly a breath of wind anywhere. Our squadron was going towards Southampton on patrol at 15,000 feet when I saw 3 Junkers 88 bombs about 4 miles away, flying across our bow. I reported this to our squadron leader, and he replied, "Go after them with your section." So I led my section of aircraft round towards the bombs. We chased hard after them, but when we were about a mile behind, we saw the 88s fly straight into a squadron of Spitfires. I used to fly a Spitfire myself, and I guessed it in the curtains of the 3 Junkers. I was right, and they were all shot down in quick time, with no pickings for us. I must confess I was very disappointed, for I had never fired at a Hun in my life and was longing to have a crack at them. So we swung round again and started to climb up to 18,000 feet over Southampton to rejoin our squadron. I was still a long way from the squadron when suddenly, very close in rapid succession, I heard 4 big bangs. They were the loudest noises I had ever heard, and they had been made by 4 cannon shells from the Messerschmitt 110 hitting my machine. The first shell tore through the hood over my cockpit and sent splinters into my left arm. One splinter, I discovered later, nearly severed my eyelid. I couldn't see through that eye for blood. The second cannon shell struck my spare petrol tank and set it on fire. The third shell crashed into the cockpit and tore off my right trouser. The fourth shell struck the back of my left shoe. It shattered the heel of the shoe and made quite a mess of my left foot. But I didn't know anything about that either until later. Anyway, the effect of these 4 shells was to make me dive away to the right to avoid further shells. Then I started cursing myself for my carelessness. What a fool I'd been, I thought. What a fool. I was just thinking of jumping out when suddenly a Messerschmitt 110 whizzed underneath me and got right in my gun sights. Fortunately, no damage had been done to my windscreen before sights, and when I was chasing the Junkers, I had switched everything on, so everything was set for the fight. I pressed the gun button, for the Messerschmitt was in nice range. He was going like mad, twisting and turning as he tried to get away from my fire, so I pushed the throttle wide open. Both of us must have been doing about 400. We went down together in the dark. First he turned left, then right, then left and right again. He did 3 turns to the right and finally a 4th turn to the left. I remember shouting out loud at him when I first saw him, "I'll teach you some manners, you Hun." And I shoved those things as well. I knew I was getting him nearly all the time I was firing. By this time it was pretty hot inside my machine from the burst petrol tank. I couldn't see much flame, but I reckon it was there all right. I remember looking once at my left hand, which was keeping the throttle open. It seemed to be in the fire itself. and I could see the skin peeling off, yet I had little pain. Unconsciously, too, I had drawn my feet up under my parachute on the seat to escape the heat, I suppose. Well, I gave the Hun all I had, and the last I saw of him was when he was going down, with his right wing lower than the left one. I gave him a parting burst, and as he disappeared, I started thinking about saving myself. I decided it was about time I left the aircraft and bailed out, so I immediately jumped up from my seat. But first of all, I hit my head against the framework of the hood, which was all that was left. I cursed myself for a fool, pulled the hood back, wasn't very relieved when it slid back beautifully, and jumped up again. Once again, I found space in my seat, but I had forgotten to undo the straps holding me in. One of them snapped, so I had only 3 to do. Then I left the machine. I suppose I was about 12 to 15,000 feet when I bailed out. Immediately, I started somersaulting downwards, and after a few turns like that, I found myself diving headfirst to the ground. After a second or two of this, I decided to pull the hood forward. The result was that I immediately straightened up and began to float down. Then an aircraft, the Messerschmitt I afterwards heard, came tearing past me. I decided to pretend that I was dead and hung limply by the parachute first. The Messerschmitt came back once, and I kept my eyes closed. But I didn't get the bullets I was half expecting. I don't know if he fired at me. The main thing is that I wasn't hit. While I was coming down like that, I had a look at myself. I could see the bones of my left hand showing through the knuckles. Then, for the first time, I discovered I'd been wounded in the foot. Blood was oozing out of the lace holes of my left shoe. My right hand was pretty badly burned too. So I hung down a bit longer, and then decided to try my limbs, just to see if they would work. Thank goodness they did. I still had my oxygen mask over my face, but my hands were in too bad a state to take it off. I tried to, but I couldn't manage. I found, too, that I had lost one trouser leg, and the other was badly torn, and my tunic was just like a lot of torn rags, so I wasn't looking very smart. Then, after a bit more of this dangling down business, I began to ache all over, and my arms and legs began to hurt a lot. When I got lower, I saw I was in danger of coming down in the sea. I knew I didn't stand an earthly if I did, because I wouldn't have been able to swim a stroke with my hands like that. But I managed to float inland. Then I saw a high-tension cable below me, and thought it would finish me if I hit that. Fortunately, I was traveling towards a nice open field. When I was about 100 feet from the ground, I saw a cyclist and heard him ring his bell. I was surprised to hear the bicycle bell, and realized I had been coming down in absolute silence. I bellowed at the cyclist, but I don't suppose he heard me. Finally, I touched down in the field and fell over. Fortunately, it was a very calm day. My parachute just floated down and stayed down without dragging me along, as they sometimes do. I had a piece of good news almost immediately. One of the people who came along, who had watched the combat, said they had seen the Messerschmitt 110 dive straight into the sea, so it hadn't been such a bad day after all.
Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. We can take any questions if there are any from our audience. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, Jim, and thank you for joining us, everyone online. We hope to have you back for future events. Very much. Take care.
Thank you.